It's kind of funny being a critic because I feel like I'm in a dark room writing to myself, which is exactly what this feels like because I can't see anyone at all out there. What I'd like to do today is go over my ideas of what it means to be a newspaper critic, from the very basic everyday how I do the job to my picture of how it fits into the larger political world, and what I see as its social utility and cultural significance. So it'll go from kind of the mundane to my hopefully not grandiose, but kind of significant fantasies about what it can be. And then I'm going to turn to some of the shows I've organized recently and talk to you a little bit about how I see the connections between my curatorial practice and my critical practice. So starting with my practice as a critic, I'm a newspaper critic, so I like to boil things down and pack as much into small spaces as possible. So I like to start with big ideas, and I'll start with the reason I write art criticism is to make the world safe for me. And that usually gets a snicker because you're not really supposed to talk about yourself so much as a critic or a polite person or as an educator. And it's like, but I think that any critic who doesn't tell you he's writing to make the world safe for himself is lying to you or is deluded about his practice. And what I mean by I write to make the world safe for me is I write to make more room in the world for stuff that I love, and I think it's my job as a critic to find works that I care passionately about and to try to make more room in the world for them, more time on the stage of life, to try to bring more people to them. And I say that I try to make the world safe for me because I'm not interested in just making the art world safe for me. I think art world ambitions are small ambitions and petty ambitions, and I'm interested in the way art fits into the larger world and doesn't get kind of contained or packaged or wrapped up and tucked away in this little bubble we often call the art world. And I also say that I'm doing this for me because I have a notion of myself that isn't this thing that's closed off, contained, and completely happy like a little fortress on a hill, but I have more of a kind of an Oscar Wilde conception of the self as this thing that is kind of more about infinite possibility and filled with potential, and only ever knows itself by going beyond itself to engage with the other and then come back into itself as something else. So that for my notion of the self isn't this kind of like nice little tidy unit that's self-identified and wrapped up, but it's kind of this messy, sprawling, voracious, curious, probing energy that's always reaching out beyond itself. So the work that I look at and celebrate and try to make more room for is work that engages all of that. How I choose the things I'm going to write about in the newspaper is by usually asking myself, what will make the best review? So I'm not looking at the art just by itself, but I'm looking at what I'm going to do with it to produce a thing called a review that actually is worthy of a reader's attention. So my as a newspaper writer, my perspective is aimed much more toward the reader than it is towards the artist. So I'm taking the artist is kind of in the background, and they've produced this thing called the work of art, and then I come up to that thing that's the work of art, and I try to do something with it by what it does to me to produce something else that then I pass on to a reader and let them assess for their own purposes. So I never think of the critic as this person whose job it is to explain the artist's intentions or to deliver or popularize something that's really difficult. I always think of it as it's my job to go into a space and to have an experience and then try to make sense of that experience by analyzing it, and convey that experience as clearly as possible to my readers, and then invite them to see if it's not like that with themselves also. Do you see what I mean by that it's that what I'm doing as an art critic in a newspaper is kind of like travel writing, where I'll go into a show and and have a journey, have a trip, discover something, and then go home to type it up. And in that typing it up, it's like what I want to do is take people on that trip also, and say it was like this for me. Is it like that for you too? It's there's a lot of my compatriots have this idea that a critic is an authority who offers pronouncements and kind of behaves like a gatekeeper, and then in offering these pronouncements, people just believe them. And I think that's a really silly idea. It's a really stupid understanding of what a reader is. I think my readers are much more intelligent and much more critical and judge for themselves, and that no one, if I say something is good, they just don't think, oh, something is good. But people do get intimidated by art, so I always compare it to movie reviews, and I say that when you read movie reviews, you don't just believe the critic, you actually develop a relationship with a critic by reading him often. You get to know what that critic's viewpoint is, and then you can judge what he's talking about by the lens that you kind of know him to look at something through. So I know when I read Kenneth Tran in the LA Times that usually we really disagree about the value of a movie. So if Ken doesn't like something, it usually means to me like I might very well like it. But the thing is, it's just like, it's not like to me there's actually no authority at all to art criticism, that it's like that it always is a propositional, invitational endeavor. And it's like to me the proof is in the pudding in art criticism, that you don't there are critics with great reputations, but that reputation doesn't live much beyond the last review. And that I think that if a smart critic whose reputation I respect recommends something, I'll probably go look at it. But I won't go looking at it just assuming that everything he said about it is right. I'll go look at it and test it against myself. And to me, that the claims the critic made in the piece are only as good as what actually happens when I'm looking at it. So there's always this testing between what he says happens and what happens to me. And the thing I like most in a review is something that I write, is that when I hear back from people who actually went to the show, sometimes the artist or sometimes other people, they said like, yes, I've known this artist's work for years. I've never seen it like that. I read your review, and that changed the way I saw it, and I actually saw more in it than I knew there before. And to me, that's just the absolute best thing about being a critic, in that it's in getting people to see more and experience more and to have a richer and fuller life based on stuff that I said about something that's out there. So it's the stuff has to be out there. There has to be this matter in the world, and it's going to be there whether I write about it or not. But my writing can change the way people see it, and not so much change the thing, but change the people looking at it. So that's really like my goal and the point of it all. So I don't need to interview the artist to find out what the work means, but I do find it really satisfying when I've communed or communicated with the work, and then later that corresponds with other people's similar interactions with the work, and that it actually ripples out into the world. And so I said before that my job is to go before these objects, go before these installations, go before these shows, and have an experience and try to account for that experience. And I think that's to me, that's just how all art works, but there's kind of a strand of art that I think downplays bodily, time-based experience and plays up text-based intellectual reading, and it really ignores experience. But I think that without that experience, you can art actually nothing ever really happens. That there has to be that kind of willful giving up of control, where the work like throws the reins to the horses, or the artist throws the reins to the horses and lets the work or the horses do the running and see where it goes. And I think that without that kind of giving up of kind of micromanaging the meaning in the work, that no meaning actually takes place. I think a lot of people have this kind of Lutheran notion of art and critics and viewers, or actually a pre-Lutheran notion. Before Luther, Martin Luther, we had God, priests, and the faithful. And a lot of critics behave as if art were God, critics were the priests, and the faithful were the viewers. And in this system, there's no way for the faithful to get to God without going through the priests. So there's no way for the general public or the viewer to get to the art without going through the critic. I think that's a really old-fashioned and conservative way of looking at art that's still actually in play a lot. My idea is I'm still happy to put art where God is. So for me, art is God. But I think that up here with art, I'm over here as a critic relating myself to it in this fashion. And then what I do in this relationship is report back to viewers over here who are on my plane, and I say, I relate to it like this. Why don't you go look at it and relate to it like that too, and see if it isn't true for you too? So I don't think of myself as any way a gatekeeper or a mediator or kind of the in-between guy, the middleman between the art and the viewer's experience of it. I think of myself as on the same footing or on the same plane, another viewer who's probably looked at things more than that viewer, but is in no way qualitatively different from that viewer in the way that the priests were in the pre-Lutheran notion of my art religion system. I think of myself as it's probably more experienced and having some kind of expertise, but in no way fundamentally different from the regular viewer looking at it. And this brings up the question of elitism. A lot of people think of critics being elitists, and their main job is to flaunt their intelligence to let the general public know how much they're missing and how much cooler they would be if they were as cool as the critic. And I think that's also a silly, old-fashioned, conservative way of thinking of criticism. And one way my colleague Christopher Knight puts it is that the wonderful thing about art in America is that it promises that everyone can be an elitist. And I think that this is a really terrific phrase, because it's not, the elitism is kind of voluntary and self-cultivated, and it's about developing your own aesthetic and your own look, and building things that matter to you, and not being born into a form where the critics have the power and you don't, or the other people do and you don't. That kind of landed aristocracy elitism has no place in the kind of democratic sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps or develop your own world. And I think there's a sports analogy that I like to refer to, because it gets clear this everyone can be an elitist thing. There's this idea also that art is elitist, and it keeps people out. And I think that that's not true. That of course you do have to have some leisure to be able to have time to look at art and cultivate a relationship with it, but nothing much more than the average sports fan, where when I'm a pretty avid reader of the sports pages, and I follow baseball and basketball and football, and I just don't have any interest in hockey. And when I read the hockey articles, I don't understand them at all. But this isn't because hockey is elitist. It's because I'm not interested in hockey. And I think that a lot of people that think that art is an elitist activity just aren't interested in art. And I think that if I did develop an interest in hockey, I have no doubts that after 6 months or a year or 18 months or 2 years, I couldn't become a pretty avid fan and pretty intelligent connoisseur of the sport's finer points. And I think that art is a similar sort of sport, that is not, that if you do become a fan by educating yourself, by looking at it, and you can actually raise yourself to a pretty sophisticated level of connoisseurship or appreciation or understanding of it by learning its history and its format and its elegance and all that. But my point in this is that hockey isn't any more elitist than art is, but art gets stuck with it because people actually aren't interested in it, and then they're mad about not getting it. And I think that that's just a short-sighted way of looking at it. Let's see. Oh, another problem I have with my other critics, which I will say something else. Also, I think as a critic, you have to have your opinion, and your opinion can't be like anyone else's opinion. Because if you're just, if you and another critic share everything, that the town isn't big enough for both of you. That to me, being a critic is all about having an individual opinion. Loads and loads of my colleagues who write for newspapers all over the country don't think it's their job to make judgments. They think that their job is to educate. And I think that this sells education short, and it sells criticism short. And I think as a critic, a huge part of your job is making judgments. I think that when I'm writing my column, I judge which shows to write about. I decide, and I make my case for the works in the shows. In the show, I judge things by determining which works are more important, which things I should focus on, and what I should argue for. And it's all completely about judgment. My colleagues think that their job is really to educate people, and I think that that's condescending and demeaning both towards the art and towards the people and towards real educators, which I happen to be as my day job. And I think that it's that at a certain point, people stop needing to be educated and they just start living. Where it's like, my example with this is like, you study, say, a language, French, and you go to classes and you do your exercises and you speak it and you stumble. And for a while you're in school, but eventually you're going to have to leave school and go living and speaking French. And you'll still learn it, but you're not being educated in it. So, and I think of what I do in the newspaper as something that people can learn a lot from, but it's not me educating them. And maybe it's not a black and white distinction, but I think it's a significant one in that, like, I think there's loads you can learn from what I do in the paper, but I'm not doing it to teach you things. That I think that it's like, it's welcoming you in or inviting you in or letting you into a world where it's kind of like this self-education happens. And I think that it is all about judgment and opinion. And a lot of people, my colleagues who are afraid of judging things because that implies that some things aren't as good as other things, and that goes against this egalitarian notion of everything being equally interesting, which I think is just silly. I think that some things are more interesting than other things, and those are the things that I'm drawn to and want to talk about. But they also think that criticism is this kind of objective practice where there's where it's not about subjectivity, and I think criticism is 100% subjective. That there's not much there beyond counting the paintings in the room to let someone know that that's the objective facts of things, but everything else in the review is subjective. And I think of it. that what I do in the paper is a lot more like the opinions page than the front page. So I'm not that kind of journalist that reports the news in as telling as much of the story as possible, but I'm the kind of critic who's making an argument for things I think are meaningful, and that it's not about just reporting the news, but it's about making an argument. And also, there's a lot of my colleagues think that it's the critic's job to put the art in context. And I think, again, they're getting it bass-ackwards, that it's not I don't think of my job as putting the art in context. To me, that's like taking the art and plunking it in history, putting it where it belongs, closing the drawer, and it's gone and safe forever. I think it's my job as a critic to put viewers in the context of the art. I'm always, as a writer, trying to emphasize that art is this entity that actually functions, that actually works, and that has consequences, and that has power, and that I want to then take viewers and put them in that context and then let things happen. So it's much more starting with the object and going from the object in the show out into the world to viewers where consequences happen, rather than looking at the object, going back towards the artist, back towards the artist's intentions, back towards history, and writing some tidy narrative that brings us up to the present. I'd much rather start in the present and go towards the future and what the work might do in the world. Another colleague of mine, Dave Hickey, has said before that he says critics in America are hated not because they're powerful, but because they're weak, and Americans hate weakness. And I love reading Dave because he always takes what seems to be common sense and turns it on its head. And he has this view of criticism is kind of like the little lifeboat that goes bobbing after the big yacht, and the big yacht being the work of art. And he has this notion that if the big yacht work of art sinks, the lifeboat's going down with it, and it's not going to help anything. And he finds it that he loves writing about art rather than writing about life is because he felt that his writing about life always kind of killed or mummified or froze that kind of a whoosh of experience of life. But when he felt that he wrote about art, when he kind of hooked his little lifeboat onto the big yacht of art, that he actually wasn't killing it, because art always would exceed and expand and extend beyond the life of the things said about it. That you'd always have to go back to the work and experience it in the present, and that always exceeded anything that the writing can do about it, could do to the work. And I think that that's something that's really attractive. That notion is really attractive to me, that art is this thing that in a way isn't set in history and fixed, but is always open to the present and engaged in the present and alive in the present. And I think that I can go look at works that are hundreds of years old, and they still, the ones that are alive and have something going on are alive now, regardless of their history. And to me, that's where the real excitement and the charge and the power of art lies. Another friend of mine, Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe, has a problem with art historians, and he says, and this is his phrase, is like, they're always trying to make the present disappear up the asshole of history. And this image came to my mind, like, and I said, well, my spine's not flexible enough to quite do that. But his point was that he found lots of historians were really trying to make the present go away, and that and what he was looking for in work and what he was interested in work was like work that couldn't be completely explained by all of its antecedents. So there was something new and alive and vital and positive in it, and something that was like, unknown and risky and strange and scary and possibly scary and unfamiliar in it. And that's the excitement that he found in it. And I kind of agree with that. and also the for me, criticism is really, really important, especially in a newspaper, because for me, I'm writing for readers, and I'm not just writing for readers who are art specialists, kind of people who have been bitten by the collecting bug, or are art junkies or art addicts. But I'm also I write for people who may not be part of the art world, but may just happen to accidentally read an art review when they're looking for a movie review. And for me, it's really important for criticism and for art to be open to that kind of audience. To me, it's also really important that what I write about, the words will exist in the city at the same time the art is up in that city, and people can read it and go check it out for themselves. That it's not. I mean, I'm a fan of art magazines. I read. Well, now I mostly look at the art magazines. But what I like about the newspaper is that it's not just for the inside crowd, and it's not just a part of the trade publication, but it's open to potentially anyone. And I think that criticism is important because it's the only public formal response to exhibitions. And one thing that is important to me is that in this age of the internet and kind of the increasing privatization of experience, that where it's like to me it's like more detached and less public, where we have more info at our fingertips, but it's consumed and engaged in a distant way, kind of before screens, away from everyone. And what I like about art is that it still occupies this public space, that that if you are interested in it as much as you may be interested in hockey, you can elevate yourself to a level of engagement that's fairly sophisticated, and that these objects start to develop a public life. And I think that criticism is one of the only, or one of the few arenas where you can watch a consciousness reflecting and arguing and trying to persuade others about things out in the world that he finds significant. And I think that for me, one of the most exciting things about art is that it really is, you can, as a viewer, you can watch a consciousness in action, making decisions and building meaning. And I think that then it's important for a critic to come upon that and do something similar, and then a reader comes upon that and does something similar. And to me, this is kind of the bedrock of civility, and it's the bedrock of social discourse. And then it's like starting to argue about the meaning of things, about what's important. And I think that that's really the glue that holds a society together, and that actually differentiates us from the beasts. So from just the basic stuff of doing it in the newspaper, these are like the reasons behind the reasons I do it. I think it actually more and more in the digital phase of the information age, that this kind of public discourse is increasingly important, and also increasingly threatened. I find those TV programs that are all about, in a way that's like kind of enacting criticism without critics, where you get the shows where you judge the dancers, or you judge the home makeovers, or you judge the cooking, sometimes by a panel of experts, but lots of times by popularity contests. To me, it's a strange mutation and collapse of this otherwise world of distinct parts talking between themselves and among themselves, and kind of like shrinking it and packaging it and turning it into to me, an empty spectacle. And I think that criticism is one form where that hasn't happened yet. Along with being a newspaper critic, I'm a curator. I do things at the Parrish Art Museum in Southampton, New York, and I also do things at Claremont Graduate University. And as a curator, what I think my job is to put things together that make viewers see more than they would have seen if these things weren't together. So I don't think of myself as an artiste or a brilliant impresario, as much as like just someone who pays attention to things, kind of knows what categories they fall into, and then takes things from these different categories, scrambles them in order to produce a whole that's more than the sum of its parts. So I think of it as kind of magic, or kind of rubbing sticks together to get some heat and fire going. But it's for me, it's always about making more than was there initially. I think, and this part of what I do as a curator kind of matches or echoes or rhymes with my activities as a critic. And I think that my job as a curator is to in a show, I want to give each piece enough space for it to do its own thing, but also to converse with those works around it. And I guess for me, there's several models of curating exhibitions, and lots of curators seem to follow the model of my father's fishing tackle box or my mother's sewing kit. And like my mother organizes her sewing kit by putting everything that's alike in the same containers where she can find it really quickly. And I think that's a really smart way to organize a sewing kit, but I think it's a really tedious way to organize a show. And I find lots of shows where they kind of put all the minimal paintings over here and all the three-dimensional stuff here and all the other stuff here. And what I'm interested in is getting away from the sewing kit or fishing tackle box model of curating. And I think the model that I follow is more like organizing something like a city. So not like a bland suburban development, or not like some gated community in Beverly Hills, but kind of a fractious, raucous melange, a mismatch, a polyglot cluster of lots of different competing noisy voices that are like an urban center or a city street, where different things come together and excitement happens. And the first set of things I'm going to show you is from a show that I organized called Peaceable Kingdom, which is up now in a nonprofit space in Inglewood. And it's a 7-artist show that they asked me to do not too long ago, and I put it together pretty quickly, which is a way I like to work. And the show is called Peaceable Kingdom, but it's not spelled properly with P-E-A-C-E. So it's not the peace as in peace, but it's peace as in like a piece of pizza or a piece of something else. And my idea behind it was kind of the rapid-paced texting life we're living now. People aren't so precise about spelling things right or getting things right, that the way meaning is communicated is almost by, I think of like the hand grenade theory of meaning, where you just kind of lob it in the general direction of what you want and you hope it explodes and gets it, or it's kind of the horseshoes version where close counts. And it's and I think that the language is getting used in a sloppy way, and you get so the peaceable is misspelled, and it's and I wanted to get also that it's a broken version of the Peaceable Kingdom, which is the historically has meant end times and bliss and heaven on earth and all that great grand biblical stuff, and stuff from lots of religions have ideas of peaceable kingdoms, and I wanted to emphasize the presence distance from that past, and still evoking that past, but being kind of a broken or perverted or fallen or mutant version of it. So the works in the show, I wanted to kind of evoke that sense of ethereal wonder and bliss, but also be kind of demented and twisted and dark and fractured and torn. So it wasn't, it's if it's heaven on earth, there's a lot more earth there than heaven. The first artist I have is Assad Falwell, and he is a couple years out of grad school. They're really collages with painting. The one up there is 4 feet by 3 feet, and it's he's a of Middle Eastern descent, grew up in California. He said he always felt it was funny that people said like, oh, you come from two cultures, you fit in both, life is more meaningful for you. And he would say like, well, actually, it always has felt less meaningful. I don't fit in to the traditions I descended from, and I don't also feel American. So it actually isn't 1 + 1 is 2, it's 1 + 1 is a half, is the way he put it. And he makes these kind of dense, rich pattern pieces that are cutout images from the political leaders in Middle Eastern countries and political events there that we Westerners don't read quickly, but you can put them together and find out more as you go along. And you can see it's like some of them are cut out into flower patterns and actually emerge off the canvases. Oops. So yeah, there's this one. There's two Falwells. And I won't spend too much time on these guys. This is an artist named Devon Troy Struthers, and he just out of Art Center just actually got his BFA, hasn't even gone to grad school, but started showing. And they're it's also collage. So the pieces with Assad and Devon are, piece is just like the cut and paste collage technique. And these I loved because it's among the first work depicting African Americans that isn't about suffering and sadness and exploitation and unfairness and injustice. And to me, it was an African American artist doing something wrong to get something right. And I think that to me, it's an interesting development that he's kind of breaking out of the confines of the identity politics game that had been being played for a long time and doing something else. And he's getting one set of responses from African American viewers and another of the kind of the established, entrenched identity politics crowd in the art world, and a different response from African Americans who aren't in the art world, and then over there there's a different response from other people in the work. And I just love that he's got happy blacks in his pieces as a way of kind of messing with with expectations. These images are from a 3-minute video by Aaron Cosgrove, and it's called Happy Am I? And it's a video it's a real sing-songy, We Are the World Disney happiness song that plays like at such a pitch it gets scary. And it starts with cells dividing, life advancing like right through all of evolution up to humans, and then it takes you through all of the religions, and then there's a big explosion and it's all over. But these characters spin their arms and dance in a way, and I loved it because it was like it's not just the history of human civilization, but it's the history of all life on the planet, and it's presented as this sing-song happy dance that's pretty dark. In a really like simple cardboard cutout or construction paper cutout figures. And that's the only video in the show, and I had it really centrally located where you could hear it in all the galleries. And it's this really addictive, gets in your head, can't shut up. And I'm afraid that the gallery attendants will go insane by the time the show is over. Here's a small piece by Laura Kripke. She graduated from UCSB last spring. It's made of wax, and it's teeny, maybe 10 inches tall, of a nude figure lifting up a nude little boy to touch a butterfly. A painting called Pocahontas, where there's these. I love the overlaying of kind of American myth, European painting, and kind of Play-Doh malformed figures, where it's like this, almost like this, the kind of the dumb, lumpy version of sophisticated Renaissance painting, and like the mutant myths going on in that. There's this little figure is also like another 12-inch tall one that sits on a music box. And this is an 8-foot long by 4-foot tall painting, also by Laura Kripke, where it's this kind of like super saccharine sweet, but so much saccharine that it's a saccharine overdose. So it's like bliss turning to death and loveliness turning to repulsion, but with gorgeousness going on everywhere. Just this preposterously loaded riff off of a European painting. Another one where the creepy little figures are flipping around. The next two pieces are by Weddell. They're made of ceramic. This one is about the size of a German Shepherd, and it's a bright yellow lamb with a bright yellow kidlet grabbing onto the back. And this one's about 4.5 feet tall, of a boy with a spoon and its dog lapping the porridge, sitting on a red rock. And I like, so these are both ceramic things. So I'm putting together different media, different approaches, different looks, but I think that what I wanted from the show is no two people to be doing the same thing, but the works actually to talk to each other and to pick up connections between and among them. These are paintings by Maxwell Hendler. I don't know if they're paintings or if they're monochrome paintings or flat sculptures. It's about a 6-foot-long wood panel, which he lies flat and pours about 1/4 inch to the 3/8 of an inch of resin on top of it, and then he's tinted resin, and then just wet sands it forever to get that super high gloss and that super sleek finish. This is actually kind of it has that matte look of antacid pills in kind of a mint toothpaste color, and it's just like pure perfection, weird color. This is a white one that has a rose tint to it, and this one's fairly small, but these guys have a really powerful presence in the room. And to me, there's a sense of you're just getting a piece of something. To me, there's like solid chunks of color. I actually don't think of Hendler as an abstract artist, but as representing that color. I think of them as like almost like the fronts of fridges or the sides of automobiles, but like treating color as if it's just this physically present object. There's another by him. And a large painting by Mimi Lauder, where she starts with a little drawing. This one's called Brunch with the Serpent. And there's kind of figures in there, and kind of a serpent in there on the left. And it's a huge, probably 8 feet tall sheet of paper, which she's worked with oil pastels and graphite and colored pencil, building it up and tearing it down, and lots of scratching away of she'll paint, apply different layers of color and then scratch through one to get the other. So you get lots of kind of printmaking qualities and effacement going on. There's a sense of the paintings actually had a pretty tough life, and it's still around. This is another one by her. It's also this one's about 9 feet tall, and it has this. It looks like it could be an image, but it's almost like a broken image or kind of a fragmented image. Like kind of to me, I think of it as like old like cave painting, badly visually transmitted and scrambled with European modernism, and you get this kind of palimpsest of indecipherable stuff. Like it's almost like the image as static. But I guess technically it's a drawing because it's on paper and there's lots of line work going on. And that's the end of Peaceable Kingdom. And now with really quickly, I'm going to run through my show Underground Pop, which was at the Parish last summer. And my ideas for Underground Pop were that that pop art is thought of as an art that is all about being public, accessible, and immediately recognizable. Underground art, on the contrary, is about hiding out from that that public language, developing a language of your own, having an in-group or a group of people who don't want to fit into that. And recently in art, I felt that there was that conflict in the work of wanting to get away from the slickness and the kind of McDonald'ification of the world, that's kind of like creeping corporate globalism and perfectly packaged stuff, and hide out and be as an underground artist, but not just get stuck in the ghetto of the underground, but come back and have something to say to the public at large. There's a small wall piece by an artist named Brian Bress, who also had a video in this show that not much comes through here, but he made all the sets, made all the costumes, did all the makeup, played all the roles, and it's a really kind of crude, lots of cardboard, feels like a high school play with absolutely no budget, and the kids trying really hard. And he sets up this really kind of mesmerizing dream life between him as a boxer, a miner, and an astronaut. And the 14-minute video circles around through these dream worlds. A painting by Cole Case. I think of Cole Case as a painter of these quiet little urban moments of solitude, where you're in the big city, but you get you're alienated and distant from it. This one's called Hollywood Cemetery, and it's actually, those weird stones are there. He actually hasn't added these strange Stonehenge things, but they're there. And he combines this kind of thick, clotted material, pile up the paint to get the trees, and this kind of dissolving skies LSD meltdown in the background. A painting by Glenn Goldberg, about 6 feet tall. A real sense of kind of Americana stitching handicraft, but also kind of an Eastern mandala reflection. Lots of stenciling going on, and almost this kind of crude, funky, willful, not sophisticated, outsidery rawness in Glenn's paintings. And I think that he's playing off of, setting up these things that look symmetrical, but the more closely you look, the more the symmetry dissolves. But I felt like, I guess my underground pop show kind of also looks at early pop and goes back to that, even beyond the early pop that got famous, and looked at like the way that kind of came out of a more folk type of art. So it's a kind of like unplugged pop, or like more, not the slick advertising side, but the kind of a funky handmade side that came just before that in Warhol and Lichtenstein and Ruchet. More of Glenn Goldberg's little kind of lumpy pointillism paintings. These are small. They're about 14 inches across. These are by, they're made of felt. James Goebel is the artist. He's educated in Las Vegas, now lives in San Francisco. He's a bear, which means he's a big gay guy who wants to be even bigger, and he works pretty hard on bulking up. It's all made from cut felt, and the lines are yarn glued on, and there's a little bit of airbrush in the kind of their puffy cherubic cheeks and around the Christmas lights. But it's a real like dopey grandma's crafts going on in his work. Nothing cheesier than making a cut felt banner as a painting. And I think that these he's also looking at European painting, and I think what he's doing is taking cherubs from that, beefing them up, bulking them up, turning them gay, giving them beards, and setting them in working class settings. And there's that sweetness to like the cute little cherubs to these things, and these big doughy-eyed guys. They're kind of like beefcake cherubs, but there's a real innocence to them that I find attractive, and they're still really pop and accessible. And they're huge. They're massive paintings. This one's about 14 feet across. I mean, they're actually not paintings. They're felt collages. These are small, juicy, messy, meaty paintings by Jenny Spota, who is looking at Italian painting and Italian poetry through Italian film. So now I got the name, Pasolini and Boccaccio and some other O whose name escapes me. But it's like I think they go back to the Decameron, which is really about a meditation on the relationship between the spirit and the flesh. And actually, it's a troubling, conflicted, tortured study of that. And I think that she updates it in a really interesting way by filtering it through Pasolini's films from the 60s and the 16th century Italian stuff also, by making these really, really juicy, you want to chew on them, bubblegum dense paintings. That's also by Jenny Spota, but it's a different one where she actually made two works, cut them up, and then woven them together. And there's that real sense of conflict in her work, of the work kind of like tearing itself apart at its seams and trying to hold it together. A piece by Kristen Morgan. It's unfired ceramic, so it's unfired clay. It's basically dirt, and it's just crumbling. And it's a life-size, kid's toy car that's been out in the desert forever and blasted apart, and then made in clay that's not fired, so it's super, super fragile, and you just get this sense of mortality from it. But I like that it's taking a pop emblem and turning it into something more. There's a Mighty Mouse, similar sort of thing, that barely held together with sticks and wire, and also the unfired clay that then she paints on. But I think she captures like all that defiance of the comic book figure in a way that's beat up but still won't capitulate. And finally, pieces by Leah Jurors, where she makes all of the elements out of real kind of tacky Saturday afternoon kids' crafts, but makes these kind of harrowing, poignant death wreaths, and also a trellis where she laid down the carpet runner on the floor and then painstakingly cut it out into a network pattern, hung that up on the trellis, and then made paper ivy and run it through that. And there's all these like the sense of trying to hold on to the past, but the past getting away from one in her work. And these, she made her homemade wine and stuck it in a 5-gallon bottle and stuck the jug in a concrete rock. There's a spigot on the other side where you actually can get the wine and the paper flowers. So there's this kind of a biblical story of getting a wine from rocks, or blood from rocks, but also a cartoon side. These pieces are by Michael Lazarus, also collages and paint. I think of them as kind of desert island desperation demon emblems. Like a mandala's gone wrong with death's heads. Push-pull. Ode to Hans Hofmann. And they're on panel and they're cut out, so you actually see the wall between them. These kind of fractured, broken paintings. And finally, a Nathan Mabry, where he takes a Peruvian fertility figure that's usually about this big, and he blows it up to about this big, and he takes a Tony Smith that's usually about this big, and he shrinks it down to this big. So he takes the master of American minimalism, anonymous pre-Columbian artifact, puts them together, casts them in bronze, and gets something out of them. And I think of him as an underground pop artist, because there's a pop quality to the reuse of signs and emblems that are already in the culture, but there's an underground quality that I think that what he's insisting upon is that meaning is really permissive, and that you can't control meaning, and that even if you can own these artifacts, you can't own their meanings. And I also think of them that in this global world, that no one owns the Tony Smith worked really hard to have his work interpreted in one way, but once it becomes public, it gets out in the world and can be interpreted in other ways and used in other ways. And I think the interesting thing about Nathan Mabry's work is that he's acknowledging that yes, meaning changes and meaning shifts, and cultures are unstable and cultures are cultures rise and fall, and that some people will be angry, but others will be empowered, and it just depends who's using it for what. That's another of his. The CYA is for cover your ass, and it's a drawing with Swarovski crystals decorating the teeth. So it's a Peruvian death mask with a little bling going on. Oh, and finally, Scott Anderson, riffing off early American paintings by picturing kind of a post-apocalyptic gang of outliers gathering together to get something nefarious started. These are also pretty huge paintings. That one's actually a cavern, so it had to be in my show about underground art. And I think that's where I would like to open it up for questions. So if we could turn the lights on, and I'll try to answer anything at all. I'm open to hearing any question. Lots of critics don't agree with my approach, but I think they're wrong. And the part of that, when I say I want to make the world safe for me, part of that's almost more fighting words for other critics who are pretending they're doing it for you, or they have higher purposes. So I say it to be to kind of say, no, I'm a shameless. I'm looking out for my interests, and I think that if they fessed up to it, their interest would be shown to be ridiculous. But I think it's an ongoing thing that me throwing myself onto the uncertainty of art and letting stuff happen and then reporting back to others. I think that part's pretty true and straightforward, and I don't think that's a conflict. That it's like then what I want is like other people to come back and say like yeah, right on, man, you're great, that's cool, or it's like yeah, this time you're nuts. And then I have to take a step back and they say, well, maybe I am. But that's my point about the whole thing being an ongoing dialogue and never a last word, is that like no matter what I'm doing relating to myself, I'm never certain that it's right. But I am really interested in me being as certain as I can, and then going with the argument, offering that argument to other people, and then seeing how it plays out. And lots of times, people I really respect is like, God, I can't believe you like that stuff. And then we start arguing about it, and then more interesting stuff happens. And also things, my taste and my thinking changes. So it's to me, it really is a constant, ongoing discussion. And that's what I think a civilization is that it's never settled, but everything is not completely up in the air, but it is at least unfixed. Oh, it's at a new building called Beacon Arts, and it's at 808 North La Brea Avenue. But don't go to the La Brea Avenue that everyone in the art world thinks of, which is around Melrose and Beverly. It's over the hill, past the oil wells, onto the way to the airport. It's not too far from there, yeah. And it's a pretty neat building. They're doing a series of shows called Critics as Curators. And I think it's a smart move for a nonprofit to say, like, well, how do we get attention here? Well, we get, a bunch of people who write about art in doing shows for the first year and just see what happens. A lot of my friends told me I shouldn't do it because it was a new place and it was untested. And I said, well, thank you for your advice. And I met with the person running it and thought, like, she seems reasonable. I'll take a chance. It's because my attitude is like, you don't. If you wait for MoMA to ask for you to curate a show, it might be a while. And I think that just because she doesn't have a proven track record doesn't mean she's going to mess up. So I think that there's more similarities between and among all the arts than have been even touched on, and I think it's but I think that they're as complex and nuanced and shifting as the works of art, in that you can find parallels that last for a little while. You're not going to ever be like, oh, here is the relationship between concrete poetry and painting in the 50s. It's like that it's always changing. But I think there's loads and loads of stuff. I kind of think after I gave a talk about underground pop, I was like stumbling and stuttering, trying to say what I was trying to get at. These artists were at, of like being, accessible and general, and dealing with general, the signs and symbols of the culture at large, but doing it in a way that wants to twist those meanings and kind of hide some things to reveal other things, and to resist the kind of the corporate slickness that's kind of creeping over everything in prepackaged experience today. Someone came up after and said, oh, that's what's going on in the music world, where there's these bands that want to do this kind of indie thing, but still relate to the more well-known stuff. So to me, that would be a really nice parallel. Someone else came up and said, you talked about Warhol in your talk, but you didn't talk about his films, and wouldn't his films actually be the better model for your show? And I was just like, yeah, there's I should have had a V8. That's not the tomato soup, but it was, because he was the canonized Warhol is painting, silkscreen, graphics, sculptures, all the static stuff, and the movies are kind of his underground pop, and that would be a really neat model for the show, for the kind of the misfits and the hidden. Yeah, well, I don't think all music's about rage. yeah, but you can find a good strand of it. But there's I think there are lots of overlaps and parallels, and it's interesting to explore them. I think Richard Prince is one of the least interesting artists ever to touch a paintbrush, and he's like just the bee's knees. And I don't get. I mean, I think people that pay 6 figures for that stuff, deserve to have their money taken away from them. He's one of the most egregious. I think Mark Grotjohn, a young painter in LA, gets way more attention than he should get. Who else? The whole the YBA, the Young British Artists, I think that's like a fart in the bubble bath. I just don't. It's like I don't need to ever experience that bubble. I just think they get loads and loads of attention. Shepard Fairey, big yawn for me. And it's but it's people asked me once, with quite a bit of anger, like, explain to me why this is 6 figures and this other one is only $1,000. And I said, it's not my job to explain that at all. I'll talk about the meaning of each of those, but capitalism is irrational. Capitalism happens to be the system we're living under, and that it's just irrational. It doesn't make sense that Richard Prince is more expensive than John Wesley, but that it is. But that's one thing that I as a critic, it gives. I can have access to things without having the money that you would usually have to have access to them. And I think that's a really interesting, that the art world that I live in is kind of the art world of ideas and less the art world of commerce, where I can have intimate relationships with things I could never afford. And I think that's part of the public life of objects that I'm really interested in. That's that kind of like, who do we decide who gets to say what? Well, no one ever came up with a fairy wand and tapped me on the shoulder and said, you will be a critic. I just started doing it. And the more I did it, the more I liked it, and the more power I got. They create. It's like, but it's work you do. It's not a privilege that's given, and you actually you take the power that's just sitting around. But I do a little context stuff. What I said, I don't feel my job is to put art in its context, but it's to put viewers in the context of the art. So as a writer, I think I'm much more of a cheerleader, where it's like I'm I do some critical review. I mean, I think of all my reviews as critical, but most are big wet kisses and love affairs and reporting back on my passions, mostly because it's really depressing to slave away crafting an argument over stuff you hate to convince people not to look at it. Sometimes it's the dirty part of the job that you have to do sometimes, but most of it is trying to bring people to it, and there's a little bit of context involved. But for me, the biggest difference between my curatorial activity and my critical activity is that the curatorial activity actually involves materials and stuff and moving those 400-pound ceramic boy around and seeing how it looks there. And it is kind of it's creating a location, but it's still in a white cube. It's pretty free so there's an immediate context there. But my goal in putting things together is to make you see more than is in it, and that's kind of my goal in writing and putting words together to make you see more in a work. So they're related, I think. But I'm not a historian. A lot of people just say, "Oh, David Pagel's a historian," and I've stopped saying no because they mean well when they say it. But to me, the present isn't the past yet, and that there's still a lot of work to do to figure out what the devil today means before it's history. And I'm really suspicious of these kind of instant historifications that academic institutions require because they've run out of material for PhD students to cover. So the past has been creeping closer to the present. When I was in grad school, I wanted to do my dissertation on Warhol, and the institution was incredibly suspicious that I would be dealing with someone so recent. And now it's like Cindy Sherman is ancient history, and there's PhDs being cranked out of her. And I just think that everything is getting a little too compressed. And actually, I think that art has to live in the present for a while before it becomes before it becomes history. I was in grad school in art history and realized I was much less interested in history than in art. And I also thought that I was actually receiving training to be a professor of art history, and I thought if I did get my PhD, I'm going to get a job in North Dakota and only ever see art on my spring break. And so I thought, well, I can either move to New York or to LA and start writing about art. I knew that I wanted to write about the present, and I'm interested in the present because I'm selfish and I want to figure out what my world means. I thought New York already had enough critics, and I'd be able to write about better things for better publications in LA. So I moved to LA, and I sent letters to every publication possible, telling them who I was and asking if I could write for them. A tiny little one called Art Week, which has been around forever, which pays $30 for a review, said, sure, you can do stuff for us. So I started writing for Art Week, another free bi-weekly throwaway publication called the Santa Monica News let me write stuff for them. And every week when I'd publish something, I would cut it out, tape it, paste it to a page, Xerox it, gather these clips together, and send it to slightly more prestigious publications and claw my way up the food chain. And I remember the moment that I had sent a review to Arts Magazine, and months later, a new editor took over, and he said, Dear David, your letter's been sitting on the desk when I took over. I liked your piece. I'm going to run it in this magazine next month. Do you want to keep doing stuff for us? And I was just thrilled, silly, that I was going to be in a glossy magazine in New York, and just little by little built it up. But you got to have a job that pays while you do that. In a way, it's a little bit like being an artist, where it's going to be lots of time, lots of work with not a lot of remuneration, and you have to, have I was a gallery girl for a long time to support my art habit. And then I got a Mellon Fellowship in Arts Criticism in 1991, and that was a huge boost for me because it was the first time anyone actually took seriously in a monetary way what I did. And just after that, before that I would never call myself an art critic because I thought critics were snobs with their noses in the air, looking down at everything. And I said, I'm I write on art. And I kind of like the graffiti defacement feeling that I was messing with it. And then after a while I thought, like, get over yourself, Pagel. You're an art critic. But it did come with that Mellon Fellowship was a huge boost of confidence, and it let me quit my job as the receptionist at a Santa Monica art gallery, and I started the freelance teaching life, where you teach as an adjunct a semester here, there, and everywhere. Yeah, I don't think that art is just a reflector, but I do think it's much more of a stirrer-upper, and that it actually makes stuff happen, and that we actually see the world differently after really seeing the art, and this changes us and the world we live in, gradually, little and incrementally. But I don't just think of it as a reflection of what's going on. I think a lot of art is an antidote to what's going on, and as a response to it. It's like like kids compensate. That kids don't grow up just like their parents; they grow up like their grandparents, or oversimplifying. But it's like you don't just. And I think art's a similar way. If we're living in a world of instantaneous gratification and image glut confusion, I think art can offer something other than that. And I think particularly the art that I'm looking at, like painting and sculpture, and these static physical things. So I think it does stir, heal, wound in other ways, transform. But I'm really interested in the transformative effects of art, not just in it as a mirror. I think that artists actually have critics built into them, and that as you're making and creating, you're also criticizing and transforming. And I actually think that every single work of art is a critique of the society that it comes from. Because I think that artists are making something that they can't buy in any store. If you as an artist if you could just go buy what you're working on in the studio, that would be so much easier, and you would do it. But I think you can't, because the civilization or the culture or the commercial setup hasn't made that for you. So you look at the world, find that world lacking, and remedy that lack by making this thing that the world needed to be a better place. I mean, that sounds dorky, but I think that's true. And so I think that there's this idea that, oh, my work is critical, and you get these like really kind of simplistic, finger pointy, pat myself on the back political work, where I think like every single work of art is a critique of its the world it emerges from, and a solution to the problem, and a proposition for something more. So I think that being a citizen is about being aware and open and engaged, and I think that's like the kind of prereqs for being a good artist. My Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe, that friend, had that nice quote about the butt of history. Also differentiates between consumers and citizens, and he thinks that citizens are critically engaged thinkers, and did I say citizens? Citizens are critically engaged thinkers, and consumers are just pigs at the trough. And I don't think of artists as pigs at the trough. They're doing something much more socially responsible. But I just want to expand the idea of social responsibility from like this narrowly political movement of art that gets called political art. I think that those Maxwell Hendler monochromes are as critical of the world they come out of as anything else. I'm less concerned to hang the tag true art form on anything, and especially on any broad medium or technique. I'm much less interested in doing that than in finding something interesting in any field. And I think that it's like, nothing isn't intrinsically anything, but anything can be made interesting. So I don't think I think there's plenty of paintings out there that are far less interesting than some advertisements. But I'm not going to say like, oh, that advertisement's a work of art, because then you get all this baggage that goes with the term. And I would rather just discuss what's interesting about the advertisement. And I think it's actually, sometimes you can get away with more in a a field or discipline that doesn't have these expectations with them, and if you can, that can be a powerful move. I think as a writer, one of my main goals is to get away with as much as possible from my editors. That it's about sneaking into the jewelry shop and or the china shop and being a bull without getting without breaking things. That anything can be powerful and engaging and stimulating. And whether you call it, I just don't. I think that I teach in a department where some people are really concerned about the difference between painting or between sculpture and installation, and I get a little worn out about the argument because I want to know, like, at the end, if that's the goal of the argument, and then when it gets resolved, what more do you know? And I would rather know more right away than have a tag for something. Where I teach, we give out an MFA degree, and that MFA degree is designated like MFA painting, MFA sculpture, MFA installation, MFA photography, and we had 11. And then the 11 started to grow, and then a lot of students wanted to start combining them. Or say, I want my MFA painting / installation, or I want my MFA video installation sculpture, and it just started to get to be this big mess. So my idea was, why don't we just give out one MFA, and that MFA will be in art. And it's worked out really nicely for the staff because it cuts down on paperwork. But I also think that it actually reflects the world we live in now in a more accurate way, where lots of artists do lots of different things, and if you just stick with art, you're fine. I mean, we still have plenty of people that come in as a oil on linen painter and go out oil on linen painter, and they still get an MFA in art, and they're fine. And you can look at all their coursework, and it's all in painting. But I just think in terms of the way the world works, it's just easier to call it all art, because it would, if you really want to get accurate descriptions of all the media, it will just be a comical kind of Borges story about categorization. So I think the world will follow my lead and eventually catch up, and they'll just be and secretaries all over will be happy that they don't have to do all that tedious paperwork. I don't spend a whole lot of time putting my stamp of art approval on things. I like try to dive into the material and get out what it's saying. I mean, my job is art critic, so I talk about what's happening in galleries, but I've never said that's not art. I have said that's crappy painting, or that's like, and it's like, or that's the lamest sculpture I've seen since last week, or whatever. But it's like I just think it's those is it art discussions? They leave me empty. I'm much more into particulars and specificities than in generalities and categories. And it's like, I mean, I'm a bicycle nut. I love my bicycles. And it's like, they're beautiful objects, but I don't think they're art. They're gorgeous bicycles, and that's enough. They're better than some sculptures. Any more? Well, thanks a lot for listening. Here.